Hi, and welcome to the Always Evolving podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick. One of the most heartbreaking experiences in life is being betrayed by someone that we had allowed ourselves to trust. And betrayal is a very traumatic experience and not something that we can ever be prepared for. One of the hardest things about betrayal is then trying to decide how to move forward. Joining us today is Jason VanRuler, licensed therapist and relationship expert. Jason is here to share with us some insights on what it looks like to rebuild trust after betrayal. It's okay that we don't have it all figured out. We're all just taking it a day at a time. This is Always Evolving with Dr. Liz. Jason, welcome to Always Evolving. I'm so excited to have you.
Hey, I am literally thrilled to be here. I've been looking forward to it all day.
Yeah, in the midst of your 1,200 other podcasts that you did today. Don't try to act like I'm special.
This is my favorite. You are the favorite of the week. Don't tell anybody, but you totally are.
I'm telling them all, but glad to hear it. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a therapist. I have a private practice, and then I do a lot of work around intimacy and relationships. And so as part of that, do a lot of workshops and intensives with individuals and couples, just trying to get them connected. And it has a lot to do with what we're talking about today with betrayal, because that does happen in our intimate relationships, and it's super painful.
It's so painful, and it is often not looked at through this lens of trauma, which it truly is, because the way that I define trauma, and not that I invented this definition, but is that anything that shatters our worldview. So the way we once thought of the world, the way we once really thought of ourselves or our relationships, we can no longer see it that way because of the impact of this event. And I know for you, like that is a lot of the work that you do is around treating this betrayal as a trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, there are definitely people who would say, well, that's not traumatic. And I would argue those people haven't been through it. So that's easy to say if you haven't been through it. But if you've been through it, what it is it's just really trying to reconcile what you thought was true with what was actually true. And at that intersection is most definitely trauma.
Right. And these are the experiences that we lie awake in the middle of the night trying to figure out, what else did they lie about and where else have I been betrayed and who else is lying to me? And the ripple effect of betrayal is so daunting and so overwhelming. And when you're working with clients on this, what are some common forms of betrayal? So we often think straight away infidelity, but there's a lot more ways that we can be betrayed beyond infidelity.
Absolutely. I mean, infidelity is that's the go-to that people are going to think of, just like you said. I think also financially, we can make financial decisions that betray someone else. But also even just sometimes what we signed up for, if that's inaccurate on purpose and we don't tell the other person, that can be a huge betrayal. For instance, if you get into a relationship where someone is saying, I want to be married, or I want to have kids, or I plan to relocate, and then it turns out none of that was actually true, that in and of itself is a huge betrayal.
Yeah. And one that really rocks your world, for sure. Where do you start with your clients when you're working to rebuild trust? And when we're talking about rebuilding trust, it's not only in a relationship. So if they choose to stay with that partner, that's one way that we can rebuild trust. But also, even if you're working with the individual, they have to learn how to rebuild trust in humanity. And a lot of times, where do you start with this type of work?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the beginning of the work is really just to meet them where they're at in the pain. I think so often if someone's betrayed, it's like they have to really lobby for anyone to actually see them in that space. There's a lot of like, oh, I'm sorry that happened, or it'll get better, or all these sort of platitudes that we tell people. But the first thing that people need most is just to be met in that space. And so that's really my goal, is like, how do I help them see that they're not alone there, and then walk through this with them?
Which is so the validation and the normalizing and the like, I hear you, I see you, I'm here with you, can be in and of itself such a healing process, and can feel just there's so much safety in that, especially when you have been betrayed and you feel really alone. You feel like you can't trust anyone around you. So I think that's really important for building safety. And then where do you take it from there? So after those initial feelings have been validated, how do we start to actually rebuild?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the question is, what are we trying to rebuild? Are we trying to rebuild trust in the relationship or just individually? Because I think those are two separate things. The relationship is one, but we also have to trust ourselves. because so often the person who's been betrayed really wrestles with, I thought that I knew, I trusted myself and now I can't. And so we have to start there, actually building some confidence in knowing what you think, knowing what you feel, and trusting your gut again, because if you can't do that, everything else is going to be difficult.
And that's so true. That, I mean, so common. We hear our clients say, how can I trust myself? Like I put myself in this position, or I allowed this to happen. And I think that that also really needs to be addressed, that you did not put yourself in this position and you did not allow the betrayal to happen. It is something that did happen to you. And we could certainly get into the nuance of, which we hear all the time. Well, didn't you see the red flags? Well, didn't you? That is such an invalidating, dismissive thing to say to somebody's broken heart. How would you help somebody to start to rebuild trust in themselves? So as you're saying, like, that's got to be the first step. What might that look like?
Yeah. What is true today? So we start there with what is true today. And really, as part of that, what is true today in the sense of how am I feeling? Can I just be honest about that? If I can start there, I can build from it. But like you said, it is so often people kind of say like, well, but didn't you see this? But didn't you do that? And so helping people kind of cut through that and say, well, of course you didn't see it, because that's not how you look for things. That's if you go someplace and someone is on drugs, they can always find the person who's doing drugs because they know what to look for. Believe it or not, that never happens to me. I could never pick a person out that does that, because like that's just well outside of my life. And so we hold ourselves accountable for what we know now. And then we use it to hurt ourselves in reverse and say, I should have known. So one of the first things is just, can I be honest with myself, and can I start to give myself grace? And in that spot, I build trust again.
Yeah, which is so hard. I mean, that part in and of itself can take quite some time of just building trust in yourself. If somebody is choosing to stay in the relationship with the individual who has betrayed them, where does that process start, and how did they start their healing together?
Yeah, that is totally contingent on the other person, the person that hurt them, being willing to do the work. If they're not willing, there's really no trust that's going to come from this. And so that's actually the first step. And what I see is so many people say, well, they say they're willing. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. Like, words are so cool. I make a lot of money off words. But, actually, if there's no action, it doesn't matter. And so saying you're willing and being willing are two different things. And I want to see them take action. And only then is it worthwhile to work on it.
I love that. And that is so important. And I talk a lot about the evidence log. And so same concept that, they are going to say a lot of things to try to get you to stay and to try to, protect themselves from the loss that they've maybe created in this situation. But what are they actually doing? Like, how can you objectively identify? Are they doing their own therapy? Are they getting their own help? Are they, communicating more, whatever it is, are the things that you can objectively identify, and then creating that evidence log, literally tracking, these are the behaviors that I'm watching change versus these are the words I'm continuing to hear.
Yeah, it needs to be able to be witnessed and verified. If it can't be witnessed and it can't be verified, we can't have the highest level of trust, which is experiential trust. And so if they're unwilling to meet you in that place, it's just not going to work. Now, if they are, that's fantastic, but then they actually need to do the things so you have something to look at when you don't feel like you can trust them.
Right. And so let's say that they are. Let's say the partner who engaged in the betrayal is doing the work, they're putting in efforts. What might be a couple things that, not necessarily in a therapy setting, but even in their own home environment, or they're outside of therapy, that they can, some tangibles that they can be doing to rebuild that trust?
Yeah, they can be impeccable with their word. That's really, really important. And so I say this a lot to people, where if you're going to say it after you've broken trust, you better do it. And if you don't know that you can, you don't say it. The other thing is bringing them along with you, even when they're not there. So if you are going out with your friends and trust is not in the relationship, you might even like take a picture of the menu and say, hey, what might I order? Like, I'm trying to figure out, what do you think? Well, what does that do? Well, it brings them into the situation, but it also says, you know where I'm at. Right. And so it is a way of saying like, oh, I have to do this versus I get to do this. Like, I want your feedback and opinion. So I think if you make the trust building relational, that really helps.
For sure. And I love that first point. And I say that so often, no matter how small it is. So if you say you're going to come straight home, then you stopping at the store versus coming straight home, that's not rebuilding trust, right? Like these little things that we don't even think of are so crucial in this process. And then as you're describing this other aspect of taking them with you, and I can just hear so many people thinking like, that's so controlling, that's so intrusive, I would never. And in my mind, then rebuilding trust is really not that important to you, because when you have broken trust, you're going to have to do the hard things to rebuild.
I love that. That is a hard truth, but the truth, which is that that's what it takes. And so not everybody wants it, and it's hard, and that's okay. But if you do, then that's what it's going to require. And you can choose to have a good attitude about it and make that expedited, or you can have a poor attitude about it and not get off the ground.
Right. Absolutely. Jason, thank you so much for such valuable insights today. Where can you be found? At website, social media?
Yeah, you can find my website. It's jasonvr.com, and on Instagram, jason.vanruler.
Well, thank you again, Jason, for being here. I really appreciate it.
Hey, me too. This was great.
Thank you again for joining us on the Always Evolving podcast. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, sign up for my newsletter, and find me on Instagram at Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick. This is Always Evolving with Dr. Liz.